Attention, all Micro Four Thirds macro photographers. There's a new 90mm macro lens in town. But is it right for you? Let's find out.
Venus Laowa 90mm macro lens for Micro Four Thirds. It's sort of an update to the older 50mm macro lens, which I already own. I'm testing it in the park, but it's very windy, as you can see. I can't really get any sharp shots with it, so I'm just taking macro video instead. And I'm very excited about this review because actually I want to tell you that this is the first time anyone's ever contacted me to do a review just for my channel. Very windy indeed. And so I'm excited to show you how this lens compares to the earlier 50mm macro. So let's get going.
So first, let's take a look at the design of the lens. It's mostly made of metal. It feels very sturdy with a nice, smooth manual focus ring. I had no problems focusing this lens in the field. It has a pretty decent focus throw between 0.1 and 2x magnification. And of course, this lens is manual focus only, so you really need to have a good handle on the manual focus. Near the base of the lens, it has a magnification and distance scale too, so you can see exactly which magnification you're working at. Now, this being a 90mm lens compared to the older 50mm lens, you can see both of them side by side here. The 90mm lens is definitely a little bit larger, naturally, because it's 90mm versus 50mm. So it's a little bit heavier and longer as well. It's 540 grams. It's not very heavy at all, but it is more than twice as heavy as the older lens. And it's a little bit longer too at 115mm, so about 1.5 times the length of the older lens. Now for this slightly larger size, what you get in exchange is 90mm. So with this 90mm lens, you now have a working distance of 20.5 centimeters, which is much better than the working distance of only 13.5 centimeters of the 50mm lens that's at 2x magnification. So 20.5 centimeters, you get a much better working distance, and therefore it's much easier to take photos of subjects like dragonflies and butterflies, whereas with the older 50mm lens, you would often have to get very close to take such photos. So I think the size difference is definitely worth the trade-off for the increased working distance at 2x magnification. Bokeh. Let's talk about the bokeh of this lens, and I want to compare it with the older 50mm macro lens because that lens definitely has pretty good bokeh. So if this lens can compare to the older 50mm lens, then we are pretty safe, right? Now, bokeh is important for macro photography because if you have situations where the background is a little bit busy or has some specular highlights, you're definitely going to want the bokeh to be pretty smooth, especially when you're taking a macro subject of an insect in a nice environment, but there's a little bit of grass or something in the background. So, bokeh. Here I have a bokeh comparison chart. The 50mm Laowa is on the top and the 90mm Laowa is on the bottom. And from left to right, we've got the out of focus background, the out of focus foreground, both of them wide open, and then the stop down performance at f4.5, so we can examine the shape of the aperture. Now, from this bokeh comparison chart, it's clear that the lenses are very similar in most ways. Both are optimized for the out of focus background because the edges are extra soft in that case, which makes sense because most of the time, the out of focus area in macro photography will be the background. The out of focus foreground is pretty good too, with a slightly harsher edge compared to the out of focus background in both lenses. Also, you'll notice that both in the out of focus background and the out of focus foreground, there is very little chromatic aberration in the edges of the bokeh, indicating a very low level of chromatic aberration. Now, where these lenses differ is when you stop them down. And that's mainly because of the difference in the number of aperture blades. The older Venus Laowa 50mm has 7 aperture blades, whereas the newer Venus Laowa 90mm lens has 9 aperture blades. And you can see in this diagram that the shape of the 90mm when stopped down to f4.5 is more circular. And I think this is a big improvement because I have noticed in the field with the 50mm when you have some specular highlights in the background, such as light filtering through vegetation or trees, you will notice a little bit of a shape, and you can see that in the 50mm, the shape is not quite symmetrical either. It's heptagonal, it's a pretty obvious angular shape, whereas in the 90mm, you get more circular bokeh. So what we can say is that both lenses are very good bokeh, and the main improvement has to do with those aperture blades. So you can't really go wrong with either lens. Both lenses look good, and the 90mm has a small improvement that should make some backgrounds look even better. Sharpness. So we all know that sharpness is the most important part of photography. Or wait, is it arguing with people you don't even know about who has the best camera? Anyway, to test the sharpness of this lens, I took several shots at 1x and 2x magnification on a tripod self-timer, very strong light, and I took photos of a very particular and detailed pattern. And I compared this lens with the older 50mm. So let's start with 1x magnification. f2.8. Whoa, both lenses are pretty sharp, and keep in mind, this is without any sharpening. I do feel that the 50mm has a tad more contrast, but after some basic sharpening, they do look pretty identical. At f4, the story is pretty much the same, pretty close, but with a slight edge to the 50mm. At f5.6, there is a more noticeable softness in the 90mm with some detail loss. Keep in mind, this is a very tight crop. If we look at the same photo uncropped, it still looks very sharp. At 2x magnification at f2.8, we can see that the older 50mm again has a tiny bit more bite, and the same goes for f4 and f5.6. So considering that I got these results for every aperture at both magnification levels, I think it's probably true that the 50mm has a slight edge when it comes to sharpness. But I do think that this edge is very slight, and in practice, you probably won't notice it. So with a little bit of sharpening, I think both these lenses are very, very close. And in practice, you're probably not going to notice it. So I wouldn't worry about sharpness, even though the 50mm does look a little bit more sharp. Lens comparisons. Now you might be wondering about the other macro lenses for micro four thirds. I put the most common ones in a comparison table, ignoring both the ones without infinity focus and the probe lenses. Now, if you just want one-to-one magnification, then there are quite a few lenses to choose from, including the well-regarded 60mm f2.8 lens from OM System. However, if you want 2x magnification, which I personally do, then there are really only three main options: the two Venus Laowa lenses and the relatively recent OM System 90mm f3.5 macro. Now, f3.5 is not much dimmer than f2.8. In fact, it's just 0.64 stops slower only, so it's not a huge difference. So how can you choose between these three lenses? Well, if you don't mind manual focus and want something really small, I still recommend the Venus Laowa 50mm macro lens. But if you want the greater working distance made possible by 90mm, then it's down to the Venus Laowa 90mm or the OM System 90mm. I think the decision is pretty simple. The obvious advantage of the OM System lens is that it's got autofocus, rounded aperture blades, weather sealing, a lens button, and compatibility with the OM System teleconverters. But all that does come at a serious price. Even at its current sale price, the OM System lens is 3 times more expensive than the Venus Laowa 90mm. If I had to choose between the two, the biggest thing that actually catches my eye is the IP53 weather sealing on the OM System lens. So if I were a dedicated macro photographer who walked long distances in often rainy weather, I would probably get the OM System lens. However, since macro is more of a secondary genre for me, and the Venus Laowa 50mm has served me very well over the past 5 years, and the price is just much more attractive, I would definitely choose the Laowa 90mm, especially since I don't really need autofocus for macro. Conclusion. I had a lot of fun shooting with the new Venus Laowa 90mm f2.8 macro. I think it's a great lens, and I think since it costs almost the same as the older 50mm, most macro photographers will be served better by the new 90mm simply because it performs almost exactly the same way as the older one, but with more working distance. And most macro photographers always talk about wanting more working distance, having longer focal lengths for macro to get closer to insects and other things that are not very likely to stay around if you move too close to them. Now, there's only one reason to consider getting the 50mm over the 90mm, and that is if you prioritize size. Personally, for me, I actually like the size of the 50mm better because, as you know, I'm actually a bird photographer, and I do macro photography, but I often carry my macro lens when I'm on bird photography trips to take pictures of things like insects and sometimes even landscapes, butterflies, etc. So for me, I think the 50mm is actually a better choice, but for most people who want to do more macro photography, especially insect photography, it's clear that if you're deciding between these two lenses, the 90mm is a better choice. So I hope you enjoyed this review of the Venus Laowa 90mm macro lens for Micro Four Thirds, and I'll see you again next time.